Hello and welcome to the Arabic Hour. My name is Ghanwa Hakim. On today's program, we bring you a speech by Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, a Palestinian scholar and activist.
We have to redefine the totality of our relationship with Israel, and we are doing that, beginning with the security relationship and through political and economic agreements. Because Israel has reneged on all the agreements, it has violated the agreements, reneged on all its obligations, and preempted all final status issues. So it is incumbent upon us to reformulate our policy options, de-link entirely from the occupation, and take bold initiatives with our natural allies, once again, to change the course of history.
Today, we bring you coverage of Dr. Hanan Ashrawi's speech at the April 25th, 2015 Palestinian Children's Relief Fund Fundraising Gala at the Marriott Hotel in Newton, Massachusetts. The Palestinian Children's Relief Fund is a non-profit, non-political program that strives to help heal the wounds of children affected by war and crisis in the Middle East. In a future show, we'll bring you Steve Soseby's speech. Mr. Soseby is the founder and president of PCRF.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, a remarkable woman who doesn't really need an introduction, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Dr. Ashrawi is a distinguished Palestinian leader, activist, legislator, and scholar who served as a member of the Leadership Committee and as an official spokesperson of the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace process, beginning with the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. Her many achievements and awards speak for themselves. Dr. Ashrawi received a bachelor's and master's degrees in literature in the Department of English at the American University of Beirut, and later she also earned a PhD in medieval and comparative literature from the University of Virginia. Dr. Ashrawi founded the Department of English at Birzeit University in 1973 and served as its chair for 8 years, and later she served as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. Her political activism started at Birzeit University, where she founded the Legal Aid Committee and Human Rights Action Project. Fast forward much later, Dr. Ashrawi was elected numerous times to the Palestinian Legislative Council and was the first woman elected to the Palestinian National Council. She serves on the advisory board of several international organizations, including the World Bank Middle East and North Africa, United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, and the International Human Rights Council. Her many awards include the 2005 Mahatma Gandhi International Award for Peace and Reconciliation, the 2003 Sydney Peace Prize, the 2002 Olof Palme Prize, the 1999 International Women of Hope Bread and Roses, the Defender of Democracy Award Parliamentarians for Global Action, the Distinguished Alumna Award of the University of Virginia Women's Center, and the 50 Women of the Century Award, among countless others. Really countless others. I tried to list them all and I couldn't. These achievements are truly remarkable, but it's Dr. Ashrawi's unwavering principles, her steadfast dedication to the humanitarian cause, and her incredible passion that I find truly remarkable. She has accomplished all of this while also being a dedicated wife and mother. It's with great pleasure that I present to you this evening Dr. Hanan Ashrawi.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. Every time I participate in a fundraiser for PCRF, I see that there's a qualitative shift, a greater addition of people, of dedication, of generosity, and I always say generosity of spirit. This is what counts. I'm also deeply touched by the fact that while Syria is undergoing such a traumatic and tragic upheaval, that people are not convoluted in the sense that they look within at their own suffering only, but they reach out and recognize the suffering of others and are generous in reaching out and lending a helping hand. To all the Syrians here, we are together, we are one people, we share your suffering, we understand your trauma, and we know that Syria will prevail in the end. Yeah. And on a lighter mood, I also think Hebron and Nablus and Bir Nabala and Tantura will prevail as well. Marwan and Rula picked me up, and they've been spoiling me ever since yesterday. And I really would like to thank them for the magnificent work they're doing. Thank you for your attention and generosity and for spoiling me. It's a pleasure, as always, to see such dedicated people, such hardworking people, and with so much to give. But the one person who stands out always, and I'm deeply moved and touched by all the work that he's done and that his family has done, is Steve. Steve Sorsby. I first met you in the early 90s, right? When we were busy starting peace negotiations. I don't want to say process because it's become a dirty word. But Steve had come to Palestine in the first Intifada, and he felt that he wanted to move from being an observer and writer and reporting on the Intifada to being an activist, to doing something about it rather than reporting it. And he not only changed himself in the process, he changed thousands of countless others, but he also affected the lives of many, many thousands of Palestinians, children, their families, their communities, not just Palestinian children, as he said, but children throughout the region. And he also brought into American homes, into American hospitals and institutions, these ambassadors. Despite their suffering and so on, they came with their narratives, they came with their humanity, they came with their pain, and they entered people's homes and hearts. And they made the Palestinian narrative real and human and recognizable and understandable. And Steve has never given up. He started and he didn't stop, even in a period of tremendous suffering where I know his wonderful late wife, Huda, and we all miss her. And I remember when I saw your daughter Dima first, she was just a baby. We all should be touched and encouraged by the fact that you transformed the memory of Huda into an active presence. And the fact that Huda is not just a name, but is a force for life and for healing. And we will all remember Huda al-Masri because she was a remarkable woman and a remarkable husband, and we are very proud to have you as a Palestinian. And of course, within every PCRF chapter, I see these qualities of tenacity, of perseverance, of dedication, of generosity, as I said, and a sense of community, a sense of real commitment. And these are the qualities that I think will help the Palestinians and the other Arabs prevail and overcome the adversity that we are undergoing, to persist, to remain steadfast, and to endure, to reaffirm our identity, our history, our culture, and our rights on a very solid foundation of authenticity, of our own history and culture and identity, on a foundation of legality, solidarity, and global values. The sense of cohesion that brings us here tonight is a sense that will enable us not just to survive and to endure, but also to overcome what we're undergoing. Marwan, yesterday, where's Marwan? Asked me a question. Marwan, you asked me a question. You said you have a difficult task because the situation is so grim that after you finish describing it, where do you find hope? And I really feel that we find hope in people like the people here in this room, and the fact that the Palestinians also, despite all this adversity, have refused to succumb. Their spirit has not been broken. They have not accepted any sense of defeat, and on the contrary, they have maintained the sense of humanity, and in some cases a sense of humor as well. And the fact that they did not adopt the mentality of a broken victim, but rather the mentality of a nation bent and intent on survival. Our whole history has been a history of massacres, a history of loss. You come from Tantura, you said, but there's a massacre in Tantura. On the 9th, we commemorated the massacre of Deir Yassin and so on. And we've always said we're tired, really, of writing our history as a series of massacres. We want to write our history as a series of tremendous accomplishments. And it has to be a history of triumph. We are all in need of healing, not just the children of PCRF, because these are certainly conditions that are characterized by a sense of precariousness, uncertainty, critical transformations within Palestine and throughout the region, and of course a confluence of many adverse factors, both internally and externally. We are witnessing the Zionist agenda coming to a head. Israel, as a settler colonial project, is attempting to complete the Nakba that started in 1947-48, but actually it started earlier with the paradigm of displacement replacement. I always tell people the best description of what's happening now and what started in 47 is written by an Israeli neo-historian called Ilan Pappé. And he wrote The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and he described what's happening as a displacement replacement paradigm in which people are attempting to eradicate the very presence, the very history, the very culture, the very identity of another nation, and to take over not just their land, but their narrative. That's why when people talk about Israeli hummus or Israeli falafel or Israeli, the latest addition is frike. They think that this is an Israeli health food. It drives us nuts. It's not just the Palestinians that, stand up in arms, but all the Arabs, who share this food. That you've expropriated our land, you've confiscated our land, our freedom, and so on. You cannot confiscate our culture and our food. Or when we see cross-stitch and the Fallahi thobe being worn in modern dress by Israelis and saying these are Israeli costumes, Palestinians feel a sense of not just moral outrage, but double victimization. This is an ongoing process of negation. You don't exist, your narrative doesn't exist, your land is not yours. And the whole myth of the land without a people for a people without a land is being perpetuated with such deliberate attempts at massive confiscation and expropriation. And it makes it easier, they feel, if they dehumanize the Palestinians, their victims, and if they ultimately render them invisible, then they don't have to face the consequences of their actions. Then they have a free hand to do whatever they want and get away with it. So this displacement replacement paradigm is ongoing every day. When they build a settlement near a village in the West Bank, they give it a Hebrew name that is very close to the Arabic name of the village. You've noticed this, you're nodding. That's because they are competing over the history. It's as if the settlement was there so as long as the village was there. And it's the same thing with the whole new narrative of the Jewishness of the state. They're telling us as Palestinians that Palestine has been Jewish for centuries. And we, the Palestinians, the inhabitants of the land, the indigenous people of the land for centuries, have never seen Palestine as being exclusively Jewish, ever, in history. Even when there were the kingdoms of Judea and Samaria 2,000 years ago, 2,500, there were never a majority in Palestine. And Palestine has always been a pluralistic and open country with a very rich history, with a very rich fabric of different cultures and ethnicities and so on, but with a continuity as well. And so when they tell us that we have to accept the Jewishness of the state, they are telling us that their narrative is the right one and ours is an imposed narrative. And that's why we refuse to accept the Jewishness of the state. Not just that, but because we also feel we've been struggling to maintain a democratic, pluralistic, inclusive, tolerant society. And we are being told that for Israel we have to violate our principles and accept a Jewish state. Well, then we say let them talk to Daesh and they can talk about an Islamic state and a Jewish state. But the worst thing is that they want the Palestinians to become Zionists. And I said, there's no way that we're going to become Zionists overnight and accept the Zionist ideology and give Israel license to discriminate. Because once you accept the Jewishness of the state, it means that the Palestinians within Israel, the 48 Palestinians, can be discriminated against with impunity because they happen not to be Jewish, most of them. And not only that, but they openly say that the Jewishness of the state means that the Palestinian refugees have no right to return because they also happen not to be Jewish. So by accepting such a benign expression, like the Jewishness of the state, Israel is attempting to create a whole world of meanings and of restrictions and of constraints and of exclusion of Palestinians, and predetermining, of course, the outcome of any talks in the future. So the issue of the Jewishness of the state is very, very significant to us. That's why we do not subscribe to it in any way, shape, or form. And that's why we get really shocked when we hear the American administration talk about it as though it's something normal. Suppose the US stands up and says, you know, the leader, that we want to have an exclusively Christian state. Or suppose the Palestinians say we want an exclusively Muslim state. The whole world will be up in arms. And yet they think it's okay for Israel to do that, somehow, especially in view of the fact that Israel is attempting to displace and replace a whole nation. This has to make us stop and take stock, actually. And the prevailing patterns as a result are patterns of exclusion and exclusivity, of power politics and domination, of ideology and absolutism. And this is extremely serious, because whenever they believe they can bring God into the picture and they make God give them dispensation and license to do whatever they're doing to the Palestinians, it means that there can be no solution. Because as Walid Khaldi once said, if their God told them this is their land, my God didn't tell me that. And if this means ultimately that you bring God into the picture, then when the gods clash, there will be no reconciliation. There will be no resolution, because no God will admit any kind of mistake. So in that sense, if you bring absolutism into the picture, then you are going back to the days of the divine right, you know, that God gives you dispensation to do what you want. And it means that they can justify whatever they do to the Palestinians. And they are carrying out a systematic policy of ethnic cleansing while they are expropriating and annexing land, using violence and coercion, escalating violations, and persistent impunity, which is the key problem in everything that Israel does. Its sense of impunity, the license it has to act with impunity, the cover it has to live outside the law, to break the law and get away with it, and get a cover for it. And it has developed a sense of exceptionalism, a sense of privilege, and a sense of entitlement, which has distorted, of course, the internal culture within Israel, and generated a culture of hate and of racism, and perpetuated the captivity and enslavement of the Palestinians. And this is something that is happening, still happening in the 21st century. When we were talking about previous colonial experiences, these happened centuries ago. And we said, notice Who is supporting Israel now? Australia, Canada, and the US. And where are the indigenous populations of Australia, Canada, and the US? And Israel thinks that because centuries ago the white male Christian colonial culture allowed for the extermination of indigenous populations in different places, that Israel can do the same and get away with it. And they are saying so, that they can do that. And they think that they are part of this colonial continuum and that it can happen in Palestine. And that's why they persist in dehumanizing the Palestinians and in blaming the victim. When you're talking about Gaza, it's not just a question that they can regularly wage a war, a unilateral war, an assault on Gaza, a captive population that is entirely helpless, entirely vulnerable. And they can massacre. They can massacre thousands. Look, in the last assault only, and this is something that the mind, cannot just grasp, 92 families were totally obliterated. 92, and you know how large our families are. But when from the population register, you erase 92 families immediately, completely. And then they blame the victim. Then they say these were human shields being used by Hamas. Or it is all their fault for hiding weapons in these places and so on. Or that Israel was in a state of self-defense. Against whom? As you said, against the children playing on the beach, against the residential building that they blew up entirely with all the people in there. Is this self-defense? But anyway, the fact that every few years Israel gives itself the right to do that without any kind of intervention or accountability is an extension of this culture of impunity and hate, and of course abstracting the victim and therefore avoiding any accountability. Now, the results of the latest Israeli elections, of course, are quite predictable. I'm surprised that they were surprised by the results of the elections, because they're the natural outcome of this evolution of the occupation. The whole terrain has shifted to the right. The whole discourse has shifted to the right. The political agenda has moved towards extremism and ideology. And of course, the term occupation has been dropped completely from the lexicon. And when Netanyahu admitted that he lied when he said he wanted the two-state solution, and then later on he said he lied when he said he didn't want the two-state solution, my comment was, when do you believe a chronic liar, if ever? And it seems to me the only way is to look at facts, to look at actions, to judge by what he is doing on the ground. And he certainly is not committed to the two-state solution. He certainly is not committed to peace. And he certainly is an avowed and admitted racist. Because when he talked about the Arab citizens of Israel going in droves to vote, very clearly people said, had the Americans said, look, the blacks or the Hispanics or whatever are going in droves to vote and this will change the demographic setup of the country, people would have been horrified. But Netanyahu clearly had no problem making such statements, but worse than that, carrying out such actions that would involve things like massacres against civilians, destruction of infrastructure, of residential areas, horrific carnage in Gaza, and he gets away with it. And of course, he managed to separate issues of social justice and politics from issues of security, because to Israel, security is the great God, and we all must serve security. Now, to to Palestinians, the real surprise is that people believed that there was somebody in Israel who wanted peace, and that they accepted the two-state solution. We've been telling them since the 90s that we don't have a peace partner. We've been telling them that there has been a willful and persistent process of settlement building, of annexation of Jerusalem, later of Area C, of ethnic cleansing from Jerusalem and Area C, a systematic transformation of the land, and that the process has become, in many ways, an excuse. A process has become a means to buy more time, to create more facts unilaterally on the ground, and to negate the very objective of negotiations, and to end the two-state solution. This has been the pattern of behavior from the beginning. Another flaw, persistent flaw, has been in the strategic alliance with the US, between Israel and the US. How can you be an even-handed peace broker when you wholeheartedly support the aggressor? Not only that, but you buy them time and you give them cover for their illegal actions. This has been ongoing, and of course with enormous funding and support and technology. We'll talk about the nature of this relationship. But to us, the most demeaning part of this was this latest chapter in Israeli-American relations when Netanyahu came to Congress at the invitation of one party, Boehner, and the Republicans, and he proceeded to tell the American Parliament, both houses of Congress, that he knows better what's good for the US, that their president is making a serious mistake, that they shouldn't support their president, but they should vote, and they should take votes against the agreement that is materializing with Iran. And then he said openly that Israeli security trumps American security. He was willing to fight, down to the last American, of course. But the amazing thing was that this Congress, your representatives, and all of you here are Americans, I assume. Nobody here is stateless. They acted like the yo-yo Congress. You know, we call them the yo-yo Congress. They keep up and down, up and down. Every time Netanyahu goes to Congress, they somehow develop, there's a spring, I said, in the seats of American congressmen. And I'm sure when Boehner came to visit Netanyahu, it's to give him the patent on the spring, so that every time he wants the Congress to stand up, all you need to do is push that button. And of course, we know that Israel is a domestic issue in the US, and we know that they meddle in American politics, particularly in elections, delivering campaign funds, more than campaign votes anyway. Yes, of course, they spy, and not only that, they spy with impunity, and they want the release of the spies. And that's the country that spies most on the US is Israel. And they sell this know-how, the technological know-how, to countries that America doesn't want them to get the know-how, like China once. Remember when the airplanes were sold by Israel? Anyway, however, things are changing. I believe things are changing because we are seeing taboos being broken. People are talking about the pro-Israeli lobby. There was a conference, we talked about this with the Washington report on Middle East affairs, the latest conference they had. But before that, there were several books written. People are speaking out. The fact that the lobby is in many ways manipulating American policy. Public opinion is shifting primarily in educational institutions and universities. I've seen that firsthand among students and faculty, intellectual circles. The educated, the information technology revolution, the social media are making a difference. People do not have to rely on mainstream media now. People can witness for themselves what's happening. So we're beginning to see that develop, and we're beginning to see networks of solidarity develop and evolve. The BDS movement, even though they're trying to demonize the BDS movement, but it is a very important movement.
You are watching footage of a recent speech given by Professor Hanan Ashrawi at the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund Fundraising Gala. We'll be back with more after this short program ID.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Although we do understand that there will be a time lag between public opinion and between policy shifts, but at the same time, there is a change, and this change will make a difference ultimately. And the fact that the inclusion and recognition of the Palestinian narrative or Palestinian version of events ultimately will have an impact on policy and decision making. And there are people like you also here who know that in a democracy, your vote counts. Your financial contributions count, your presence counts. And so you can no longer be the invisible immigrants who are unable to influence events or who are not listened to or seen. And by the way, I understand that there is a move to get the Arab Americans to be registered as Arab Americans, not just as Caucasian or whatever. So that's very important, because once you get registered as Arab Americans, you get recognized as a group, and you can claim your power as well in elections and as a lobby and so on. All right, now as we said, this latest crisis, because of the confrontation over Iran and the P5+1, which I think is very important and should be followed in the case of Palestine, does this mean that there is a real shift, a paradigm shift in American policy and relations with Israel? It's too soon to say, but I don't think so. You might see small changes, but I don't think you will see a real shift in the substantive issues that form the nature of the complex relationship between Israel and the US, whether it is in terms of funding or in terms of technology and know-how, particularly weapons technology, transfer of knowledge and technology. And there are these strange issues that they call shared values, or the Judeo-Christian tradition. I keep telling the Americans who talk about shared values that I don't see how the US wants to share the values of occupation and oppression and massacres and so on. If these are your values, then you are in real trouble, because these are the values we see in Israel. And to me, when they talk about a Judeo-Christian tradition, what kind of tradition is that? Does that mean that anybody who doesn't belong to these two religions does not share those values? The only religion that accepts the other religions is Islam, as far as I'm concerned. It does not deny any other religion. So how can you deny one major religion its validity and existence? And you render, how many Muslims live in the US? 6 million? Just about. So you render 6 million Americans as being outside this tradition that forms the core of the Israeli-American relationship. This is one of the problems of looking at Arabs, looking at Muslims as being the alien, the strange, the others. Not only are they incomprehensible, but they are dangerous, and they are being profiled all over the place. But anyway, this kind of special relationship has led to the distortion of American foreign policy and has appointed Israel, the US, and we call Israel, the US very openly as the enabler of Israel. Who was it? I think it was Aaron Miller who said that we acted as Israel's lawyer in negotiations, but I think now they're acting like Israel's enabler. There is Israel is acting like a gangster, and you have a godfather there. And the funny thing is that now the US is trying desperately to convince Israel that peace is good for Israel, that the two-state solution is good for Israel on demographic grounds, that you're going to be overrun by these horrible Palestinians. You cannot be a predominantly Jewish state if you destroy the two-state solution. So you have to get rid of these people and accept a two-state solution before it's too late, and the Palestinian woman's womb proves to be more fertile than the Israeli Jewish woman's womb. So it becomes a demographic, racist, and sexist issue. And we're saying, no, peace is a right. Freedom is a right. Dignity is a right. But you do not try to convince people that, on racist grounds, that you have to have peace by getting rid of the Palestinians who will threaten the Jewish character of the state. So you have to choose between being a democracy or being a Jewish state. Democracies do not enslave other people. Democracies do not steal their land. Democracy is not implemented selectively or sporadically. And democracies do not colonize other people and other people's lands. So anyway, that's the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, the nature of the Israeli political system as it stands, with the, as I said, intensification and escalation of settlements, the annexations of Area C, the ethnic cleansing, it is an apartheid state, but it's worse than an apartheid state anyway. All are indicating that there is a willful and deliberate attempt to superimpose Greater Israel on historical Palestine. And it is happening before our very eyes and before the eyes of the world. This is extremely serious because when the Palestinians made the very painful compromise of accepting Israel and recognizing Israel on 78% of historical Palestine, that was a major concession, a major compromise, and a painful one, not easy to make. Now Israel is saying, no, we want Greater Israel, and they're busy swallowing up the rest of the land, 22%. So if they don't want a two-state solution, if they don't want the 67 boundaries, then the only thing to do is to tell them, well, the deal is off the table. There is no more two-state solution, 78%, 22%. If you want Greater Israel, we want historical Palestine. That would be the real answer. And the irony is that, is that now that there is a global consensus that the two-state solution is acceptable. I remember for years, if you talked about a Palestinian state, that was a profanity. How dare you? Self-determination, statehood, Palestine, sovereignty, and so on, these don't work. We were even forbidden from using the term Palestine in negotiations. We were Palestinians, Israel and Palestinians. Remember, I think I told you we're tired of being adjectives. We want a noun. We want Palestine. And even the term people was not used because they didn't want to recognize us as a people. It took years. It took a tremendous struggle for the world to accept the Palestinian state and the two-state solution and so on. And now that we have that, and we got a General Assembly resolution about Palestinian statehood, albeit, not full members, but still a state, Israel is intent on destroying the two-state solution. Now, of course, Israel is a rogue state. It's not Iran, it's not Syria, it's not Libya, it's not, these are not rogue states. These are further victims, and we can talk about that later, but the real rogue state in the region is Israel, because it doesn't live above the law only, it lives outside the law, and it doesn't recognize that there has to be a global rule of law. On the contrary, it thinks that it is exempt from any kind of adherence to the law. And of course, now that the Arab world is undergoing this tremendous and painful upheaval, Israel is exploiting this instability and this upheaval and the reconfigurations within the region in order to create new polarizations. The funny thing is that Israel discovered that it has new allies among the moderate Arab countries. I'm sure you've heard that. It's saying that there is a Sunni-Shiite divide in the Arab world, and there are moderate Sunni countries, and we have more relationships with them, and the threat comes from the Shiites and from the extremists and so on. So why don't we just go over the heads of the Palestinians and make peace with these moderate countries? And Palestine and the Palestinian issue is a domestic issue. We can take care of it. So it is creating these artificial constructs. And of course, it is using this, what's happening, the horror of what's happening to several Arab countries in the Arab world, including Syria. Look at Libya, and now look at Yemen. It's just incredible, in order to say that this region is so unstable that we cannot give back any land, we cannot create another Arab state that will be a violent state like all these, and therefore let's just circle our wagons and close our borders and build more walls and not make peace. And they don't understand that the only way in which Israel can have any kind of peace or stability or legitimacy is if it recognizes Palestinian rights and Palestinian legitimacy and comes to terms with that on the basis of a just peace based on international law. Otherwise, there will be no acceptance or recognition of Israel. And of course, the continued occupation and injustice will continue to be a destabilizing factor throughout the region. And Israel will continue to encourage extremism and violence and ideological absolutism, because these are the methods that it uses and it recognizes. And of course, it thinks that these are diversionary tactics, that this will marginalize the Palestinian question, and therefore they can do whatever they want and get away with it. This is extremely dangerous. Right now, of course, what we need from the Arab world are several things, but one of them is not to take sides within Palestine, not to feed the rift, and of course to protect the refugees in their countries. We have what we call hostages. We have vulnerable populations, multiple refugees in different Arab countries. And what's happening in Yarmouk, and there's somebody from Ain al-Hilwa also, and we were talking about the precariousness of the refugee camps in Lebanon. It's extremely dangerous there. And the Yarmouk tragedy, actually, is a mini Syrian tragedy, because the people of Yarmouk are not just Palestinians. There are also Syrians who sought refuge in Yarmouk. And there are now, what, 5,000 people left in Yarmouk, and Daesh is on the rampage there, and there's tremendous violence. So we need to be able to have some sort of intervention in order to protect these vulnerable populations. Also, we do not want to see Israel attempting to exploit the rift in order to create a statelet in Gaza or a mini-state, in order to maintain this rift, and in order to create what it calls a long-term ceasefire, in the sense that you will have an interim phase, and every few years it will continue to bomb and shell and destroy Gaza. And they would like, of course, to have a long process of negotiations, because from our experience, negotiations since 1991 have acted as a cover, have enabled Israel to continue with its settlement activity, to continue with its policy of unilateralism and violence, and to enjoy legal cover and impunity. Remember when Shamir talked about how he will prolong the talks? for 10 years, and then he will fill the West Bank with settlements, and the talks will be irrelevant then. There will be no need to make peace. This is what's happening. And we keep reminding all countries who say that there can only be peace only as a result of negotiations, as a result of bilateral negotiations, that we are the only people on earth in this asymmetry of power, and this was quoted by, elsewhere, who are being told you have to ask your occupier for permission to be free. There is an occupier and occupied. It is not a situation of parity where you have two states and a border dispute, and you say you have to solve it through negotiations. This is a situation where you have a powerful country, the fourth strongest army in the world, enslaving a whole nation, and you're telling both sides that you have to negotiate. Both sides must want peace. That negotiations is the only way out. So we said we want third-party intervention. What did we get? The US. Anyway, so we keep telling people it's not that we need bilateral negotiations. We need international intervention. We need to have the talks based on international law, if there are to be talks, and we need to have a clear, not just clear terms of reference. We need to stop Israeli violations, but we need to have clear objectives with concrete steps to end the occupation within a time frame. And Palestinian self-determination must not be made subject to an Israeli veto, because bilateral negotiations in this power asymmetry means that Israel can decide. So we have seen the disastrous consequences of bilateral negotiations and American bias, and especially after the horrific carnage in Gaza, we need game changers. We need a whole new approach. What has been happening the last 25 years has been extremely costly and painful. And we need to think outside the box, to use a cliche. That's why we went to the UN. We went to the UN not because we think it's perfect or ideal, but because we wanted to change the approach to peacemaking. We went to the UN because we want to say that the international community has to be involved. Multilateralism is the name of the game. International law is the basis of any agreement. And of course, it provides Israel with some kind of accountability and Palestine with some kind of protection. And more importantly, it designates the status of the Palestinian territories not as being disputed the way Israel wants, and therefore up for grabs, because it calls the West Bank disputed territory. That it is occupied territory, and that it has boundaries, and that Jerusalem is the capital. And of course, when you talk about international law, you talk about the right of return of the refugees. But most importantly, it means that the right to self-determination is recognized for the Palestinians as a whole, and we will have access to international organizations, agencies, conventions, and agreements. And to us, this is one way of carrying out nonviolent resistance. And we need to carry out nonviolent, active, intrusive, creative nonviolent resistance, which is a positive and moral and legal and human, as well as a constructive response to the occupation. And it should curb Israeli violence and violations, particularly in view of the failure of the so-called peace process. And it is sending a message to the Palestinians that there is hope and that violence is not the only alternative. And of course, it will help us reposition Israel within the law and empower the Palestinians, or Palestine now, we should talk about Palestine. And that's why we acceded to the Rome Statute. People told us, if you do that, if you accede to the Rome Statute and you join the ICC, it's the end of the world. So Israel withheld our funds, of course, and Congress is threatening all sorts of dire consequences. By the way, I don't know if you know how powerful Congress made us. Have you thought about this? When they legislated that if we join any organization or international agency UN agency, that the US will leave it. It will stop paying its dues. This is what happened in UNESCO. When we joined UNESCO, because there's a long process in which we've been asking to join UNESCO, the US and Israel stopped paying their dues, so they lost their voting rights, and they became observer states. And in their overzealousness to show how protective they are of Israel, they passed a bill, I think it was 1991, that any organization that Palestine joins, the US will leave. The US will not pay its dues and therefore will lose its voting rights. We have the power to isolate the US now. Imagine what will happen if we join the International Atomic Energy Agency. We want the whole Middle East to be nuclear-free, a nuclear-free zone, beginning with Israel. Imagine if we join WIPO, the World International Property Organization. What will happen? What happens to the American economy when China has the full freedom to use all American patents and copyrights and so on, because the US is outside WIPO now, or WHO or anything else, WTO, trade, and so on. So we are being told, do not rush into these things because Congress will punish you. I think the only thing to do right now is to join all of them, if we can afford it. And see what will happen, because the UN was told that if they accept Palestinian statehood, and I can tell you openly that Ban Ki-moon and Robert Suri and all these guys came and said, please, please do not ask for a resolution for statehood. The US will not pay. They pay 22% of our budget, and if they don't pay, we'll be in trouble. I said, look, Israel withholds 40, 50% of our budget. And we've taken, 60% cuts, 40%. Why don't you take some cuts too? But actually, the US did not withhold their contributions to the UN when we were voted a state. You know why? Because if they lose their membership, they lose their influence. And so they decided, they found ways around this, that, no, if we got this recognition through the Security Council, they will not pay. But if we got recognition through the General Assembly, that's okay. So they paid their dues. Anyway, we joined the ICC by acceding to the Rome Statute. As I said, we asked for a Human Rights Council to send a commission of inquiry, and they did send one. Israel wouldn't let them in, but at least there is a beginning of investigation. We joined the Fourth Geneva Convention, all conventions and protocols, of course, and we became a high contracting party of the Fourth Geneva Convention, so we can hold Israel accountable. And we are having meetings in order to discuss ways of implementation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. We joined 34 of them, of course, with a twofold purpose of defining the nature of our state with such conventions like CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, or whatever, and other conventions dealing with the sea, with the passages, with international crimes, and so on, to govern our relationship with other countries, to be part of the international community. So we are dealing with governance and social justice, as well as dealing with protection from Israeli incursions and violations. And we have, and as a way of not just curbing Israeli violation, but dislodging its stranglehold on Palestine and the occupation itself, and bring international law to bear. And we must make the occupation costly. So far, the occupation has been extremely profitable in more ways than one. And the one way of making the occupation costly is for the international community to hold Israel accountable in economic terms, which is what's happening with Europe now, gradually, it's beginning to happen with the guidelines and now with the labeling process. But for us, the ICC is important because of two things. We have to stop the settlement activities according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, yes, but to the Rome Statute, settlements are a war crime. And it's an ongoing war crime with no statute of limitations. And two, we want to bring Israel to the ICC, International Criminal Court, on the massacres and war crimes committed in Gaza last year. And we didn't mention the whole history of carnage and massacres and so on because it would be impossible. This means that for years then the court will be held up looking at facts and evidence. When you give them a specific case like 2014 from June on, then they will deal with that situation. And we are providing them, we have a committee, we're working on this, and we're providing them with the facts and so on. And that's why both Israel and the US reacted hysterically, because for the first time, there is a will to hold Israel accountable, that Israel will be judged in accordance with the law, and that there will be an investigation, and that there will be a price to be paid. And of course, it will also prevent Israel from carrying out another carnage in Gaza, because every few years Israel has to test its weapons, its new weapons, and to increase its sales by killing a few thousand Palestinians in Gaza. We need to buttress our international relations and standing to empower ourselves. Now we have Sweden has recognized Palestine, which is great. There are many parliaments that are talking about recognition and that have voted for recognition. Public opinion, as I said, is moving. The increasing solidarity networks and so on, where you come in here. And we don't just need economic support, we need political support. That's why we're supporting the French initiative, even though we believe it has to amend its language. We can talk about that later. New Zealand itself. We must end the American monopoly on peacemaking, and we must have international participation. And as I said earlier, with a concrete time frame, ending the occupation and bringing about a full withdrawal. With the Arab world, we do not just need the Arab Peace Initiative. We understand the trauma of what the Arab world is going through, but we do need positive intervention, and we cannot be part of the polarization that is taking place. Palestine must remain outside the polarization, because we do have vulnerable populations, and we cannot pay the price anywhere. And we have taken this position. We stand with the people, always. That's it. But we do not belong to any polarized camp, especially as we talked about the Yarmouk camp and about the other refugee camps. And we need safety nets, not just economic safety nets, but political safety nets from the Arab world. But most of all, we need to act internally. We must heal the rift. I know it's difficult. It's becoming even increasingly difficult. But we have, especially with this factionalization and more self-interest, negating national interest. We have several agreements which must be respected and must be implemented, whether it is the Cairo Agreement, the Doha Declaration, and others. And the reconciliation is not just a state of mind, and it is not just an emotional situation. It has to be translated operatively into structural, procedural, institutional reconciliation and reunification if we are going to carry out the reconstruction of Gaza. This is very serious. So long as we are divided, so long as we do not manage this political and comprehensive reunification, we will be weakened. The cause is weakened as a whole, but Gaza will continue to suffer. Again, internally, we must reform the PLO, we must revitalize our whole political system and delegitimize our political system by means of elections. We talked about this yesterday. Without elections, our system will lose its legitimacy. And not only that, but the younger generation will continue to be excluded from decision making. And women, of course, will continue to be excluded. As we said, it's a man-made disaster, and it's about time that women solve it. And we must continue with our resistance by creative means to expose the brutality of the occupation. And as we said, isolation and delegitimization take place precisely because of the occupation and Israeli measures, not because the Palestinians decided to isolate or delegitimize Israel. We have to redefine the totality of our relationship with Israel, and we are doing that, beginning with the security relationship and through political and economic agreements. Because Israel has reneged on all the agreements, it has violated the agreements, reneged on all its obligations, and preempted all final status issues, so it is incumbent upon us to reformulate our policy options, de-link entirely from the occupation, and take bold initiatives with our natural allies, once again, to change the course of history. And to do that, it is imperative that we mobilize our own internal resolve, not just as Palestinians, but as Arabs, and Palestinians, whether in exile, under occupation, or in 1948, within the 48 boundaries. We must learn that our rights have to be enacted, and we must grasp our freedom and dignity as an act of collective will, regardless of where you are as a Palestinian, in exile, under occupation, in 48 Palestine. But ultimately, I am confident and I have hope, because with people like you, we will prevail. We will be undefeated. Thank you. Thank you.
That was coverage from the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund Fundraising Gala of the speech given by Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Stay tuned, there's more to come after this short program ID.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us now, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you remaining with us for the rest of the hour, please enjoy the last musical segment, followed by the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, wishing you a pleasant week.